The time is now 12:30, so we'll begin our meeting. This meeting is now open to the public and we have started recording. We'll begin with an introduction to our Spanish interpretation, as well as our language justice statement from Tanya Johnson.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Tanya, and I'm the interpreter for the Environmental Justice Office at CDPHE. Today, I'm working with my colleague, Valentina. I'm going to read the Zoom instructions and the language justice statement first in Spanish, and then I'll repeat it in English. Hola, buenas tardes. Me llamo Tania y soy la intérprete de la Oficina de Justicia Ambiental del Departamento de Salud Pública y Medio Ambiente de Colorado. Hoy estoy trabajando con mi colega Valentina. Antes de comenzar, quiero asegurarme de que todos y todas hayan seleccionado el idioma adecuado en Zoom. Si prefieren escuchar la presentación en español, hagan clic en el globito que aparece en la parte inferior de la pantalla de la computadora y seleccionen español bajo interpretación. Si están usando un teléfono celular o una tableta, hagan clic en los 3 puntos que están a la derecha donde dice More o Más y eligen el español como su idioma de preferencia. Las y los integrantes de la comunidad están invitados a hacer sus comentarios en español si así lo prefieren. Nuestra organización ha asumido el compromiso de fomentar la justicia lingüística. Invitamos a la comunidad a usar su idioma de preferencia para participar en la reunión. Les agradecemos que hablan lenta y pausadamente y que usen palabras comunes para que sea más fácil de interpretar. And here's English. Before we get started, I would like to direct everyone to the appropriate language channel on Zoom. If you would prefer to listen in Spanish, please click on the small globe at the bottom of your screen and select Spanish. If you are on a tablet or phone, click the 3 dots to the right of your screen that says More and select Spanish there. During the meeting, there may be community members who choose to give their comments in Spanish. If you are not bilingual, you will need to click the English option to be able to hear the interpretation. As an organization, we are committed to language justice. We would like to invite community members to participate in the meeting using their language of preference. In order to facilitate interpretation, please speak slowly, pause often, and use commonly understood vocabulary. Thank you so much. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Tanya. Just a moment here. And we'll enable interpretation and then we'll continue here. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to also go over some quick housekeeping items. Okay, there we go. Thank you. Yes, so now language interpretation is now enabled. Thank you, Tanya. Board members, if you can please make your language selection. Now, before we start, I'm also going to review some quick housekeeping items for today. Please make sure that you've joined the meeting with either your phone or computer audio. Board members are panelists and can participate by raising their hand, which can be found at the bottom of the Zoom window. If you've joined by phone, you can press *9 to raise your hand and *6 to unmute. Because this is an opportunity for board members to engage with CAA and department staff, we ask that all board members keep their cameras on. That said, feel free to turn it off if you need to step away to tend to something. Board members, please state your name and organization each time you speak. Also, if board members can make sure their chat settings are set to everyone when they're sharing feedback, that'll ensure that everyone in the meeting can see their feedback. We are recording this meeting and we will post it to the advisory board webpage, which I've just linked to in the chat. There, you'll also find meeting materials for today, including a Zoom guidance document. Non-board members will have an opportunity to speak during our public comment period. I will turn on the chat function during our scheduled break, and at that time, you can send me your name and affiliation, and then you can join a queue of those who wish to speak during the public comment time. As a reminder, these are the ground rules we have in place in order to have a productive meeting and to ensure that we can hear from all advisory board members. And with that said, I'll go ahead and I'll turn it over to Scott.
Great. Thank you very much, Brandon and Tanya, for providing the meeting logistics and the language justice statement for us today. So welcome everyone to Colorado's 31st Producer Responsibility Advisory Board meeting. I want to thank you all for joining us. My name is Scott Cassell. I am the CEO and founder of the Product Stewardship Institute, and I am the facilitator for the advisory board. We're going to do now a quick roll call as usual. So board members, when I call your name, please raise your hand, give a wave, or say hello. So let's start with trade association seat. Well, I'll do the formal here. It says Liz is absent, but the nonprofit seat, advisory board chair, Liz Chapman. Not here. Trade Association seat, Scott DeFife.
Scott, I am GPI. I am here.
Great. Hi, Scott. Glad you were able
Hello.
to make it onto the, get some internet because we're on, Scott,
Yeah.
Darla, me and Caroline are all at a conference in Kansas City, and the internet went out. So good job for finding
And
some.
so I headed to the airport where I have a decent signal.
Excellent. All right. Continuing here, non-front range local government seat, advisory board vice chair, Gail Gary.
Yep, Gail Gary, City of Steamboat Springs City Council, and I am here.
Excellent. Retailers Association seat, Chris Howes.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Chris Howes, President of the Colorado Retail Council.
Thanks, Chris. Landfill with recycling seat, Barrett Jensen. Okay, not here. There you are, Caroline. Okay, I see you in there. Municipality seat, Caroline Mitchell.
Caroline Mitchell, City of Fort Collins, here.
Great, thank you. Murph seat, Rick Cater.
Rick Cater, Murph's here.
Thanks. County seat, Jake Neese. Absent. Environmental Justice seat, Junior Ortega.
Here.
Hi, Junior. Recyclable Material Hauler seat, Mark Petrovich.
Yeah, good afternoon. Mark Petrovich with Republic Services, and I am here.
Great. Hi, Mark. Manufacturer of recycled paper product seat, Michael Pratt.
Yeah, Michael Pratt with Sunoco, present.
Hi, Michael. Compost facility seat, Clinton Sander.
A1 Organics, I am here.
Great. Packaging supplier seat, Scott Saunders, who I don't see, but I understand he will be coming late, so he'll be signing in on the chat at some point, hopefully. Non-voting department seat, Wolf Cray. Absent. And non-voting PRO seat, Pete Hargreave.
Good afternoon, Peter Hargreave, present.
Hi, Pete. Okay. So I'm going to now move us into the business meeting. The first item of business is to approve the two summaries, one for the last meeting, meeting number 30 for the advisory board, and the technical work session meeting, technical work session number 5. So please abstain from voting if you did not attend one of those meetings. So first, does anyone have any feedback on the meeting number 30 summary? Clinton?
On the technical worksheets, Clinton Sander, A1 Organics.
Yeah.
On the technical worksheet number 5 summary, under producer dues at memo time 12:05 through 1:15 p.m. It says refuse instead of reuse. So I'm assuming it was supposed to be reuse, but it says refuse and refill instead of reuse and refill.
Yeah, we're not refusing refill. It's
What I
so
thought.
thank you. So can you say that? So 12:05, it's
Yeah, it's
reuse
12:05 to
versus
1:15 p.m. It's right at that
reference.
time slot.
Okay, and there was one before that either your internet or mine, I didn't pick it up. Wasn't clear. Was that the one comment you had?
Yeah, no, that's the one comment, just that.
One comment.
That edit.
Okay, thank you. Scott DeFife?
Thank you, Scott. The 5 Glass Packaging. Scott, I don't have any issues with anything that was written in the technical meeting summary. I just noticed that there was a healthy amount of discussion and detail, and I guess it's summarized in a fairly succinct manner. So I guess my question is more where all those notes are, when they get written down. So are they in our board folders?
So yes, they are. They're in Megan or Darla, the name of what's the summary that we have, the feedback that we get
The
from
feedback
the group
consultation. Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Um,
Scott,
so
it's in
the-
your feedback consultation folder is
Feedback
where.
the more detailed notes are in the
Mhm.
feedback consultation folder. Okay, thank you.
Yep, you bet.
Yeah, thanks very much. Yeah, Megan and I and Darla, we take detailed notes here. And we try to do the best we can about having the questions or comments and then the responses. And those are all written up, gone over. CAA, Pete, and others that have spoken get a chance to edit them. And then when they're all ready, they go to all of you and they're in that folder. That was a healthy discussion. Thank you for your question. Scott, do you have another question or is that your hand from before?
Sorry, legacy hand.
Legacy
Let
hand,
me try
okay.
to lower it. There we go.
All right. So, Clinton, your comment about reuse and not refuse, that was on the technical meeting summary?
Correct, number 5.
Okay. All right, so I was going to go to the meeting number 30 summary first. So on meeting number 30 summary, any comments there? Okay, and then we got the comment on the work session number 5. And any comments on there besides Clinton's? Right. So with those two, then making the change that Clinton references on meeting the technical session number 5 on reuse. Can I have a motion for approval of both of those meeting summaries?
This is Gail Gary, City of Steamboat Springs City Council. I will make a motion to approve the technical work session minutes from our meeting number 5 and the regular advisory board number 30 with the suggested edit by Clinton.
Thank you. Do I hear a second?
Clinton Sander, A1 Organics. I will second everything Gail just said.
Great. All those in favor? Say aye.
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 Any opposed? Okay, those two meeting summaries have been approved. All right, I'm going to quickly go over our agenda so we can then dive into business. Thank you for putting that up, Brandon. The agenda you see here, CAA, Pete will do updates on producer registration and consultation feedback. Then we're going to, that'll be up till, I believe, 1:45. Then we're going to be taking our 5-minute break. Then we'll come back and there will be reporting categories, public input, and then we'll have the meeting summary and next steps and adjourn. So with that, I will pass it over to Pete for the CAA updates. Thank you. Pete.
Thanks, Scott. Just one additional item that I wouldn't mind adding to the agenda, and I apologize, I should have added this earlier, was I just wouldn't mind having a conversation about technical working sessions as we start to move into October, November, and December. And so I just wanted to have a discussion with the advisory board as to the frequency of those meetings. We are getting into a tight timeline of writing up the sessions and analyzing all of the feedback that we've gotten. So I guess partially wondering if there is some conversation we can have about potentially lessening the frequency or lessening the load, I guess, potentially in CAA driving the content as we move into the next few months, just as we do need some time to fully focus on making sure that all of these sections are written up and we've taken into the account the feedback we've received.
When would you like to have that discussion, now or at a later time in the meeting?
I'm okay to do it at the end of the session if folks want to think about it as we go through the session, but I just wanted to make sure that if there's an opportunity to have that discussion, that would be fantastic.
Okay, I mean, the thing that comes to mind for me is the plan out for like what each technical session was going to be from here. And Darla, I don't know if it's something, I know that you did a good plan for us moving forward here with advisory board meetings and technical work sessions. So seeing what the plan is now and how you might want to expedite it or thin it down for the technical work sessions, what would we be missing as a group? Or are there open slots, for example, and we're meeting regularly, that those slots are still to be filled? That's what comes to mind for me, is like what would change if it was thinned out so you'd have more time, you and CAA would have more time. That's it. So I don't know if you can answer that question now. Yeah, Darla?
Does the board want to have the conversation at the end of our meeting or now? I guess is my first question.
The reason I brought it up now is if you needed to, if you're prepared to just have a quick answer to that, now we can then,
Okay.
I wanted to make sure we weren't waiting to the end and then it's like, searching for
Okay.
that chart that has all those meetings on it in front of you. That's what I was trying to
Yeah.
avoid.
Yeah. The first thing that comes to my mind, Scott, is we have an individual program plan that the board will be reviewing that is due January 1st, 2025. And we would like the board to get a preview and meet the team that will be presenting that at next month's technical work session, perhaps, and then have a full presentation of that IPP, individual program plan proposal, at the December meeting. So my initial thought is I respect that CAA needs time to work on their plan, kind of nose down time. And also I think we could utilize the time for other topics and hopefully keep CAA engaged because I think there are things to talk about, but we certainly could lessen their load per Pete's request, I think. So that's my initial thought.
Okay. So why don't we hold that if we can, unless anyone has any objections. Thank you, Darla. Thank you, Pete, for raising that. And let's move ahead with the rest of the updates, and we'll leave some time at the end for those of you who have some comments on how the speed of things that will be going here. Pete, over to you.
Thanks, Scott. So I wanted to provide a more fulsome update on producer registration as the deadline was, as part of the rules that were passed, was on October 1st. So this is an update as of today as to the numbers that have registered. So total registration across the 3 states is 1,773 that have registered now with CAA. That has been a large increase over the last 30 days. Not all of those producers are registered in Colorado, so that is on the side provides you with 88% of those are registered in Colorado. Some of those may be registered in multiple states, some potentially only in one state. Just another clarification on this. We have allowed producers to report as through their parent company to start with. We wanted to make registration as easy as possible. So there might be, under one parent company, there might be multiple brands that are under and subsidiaries that are under that one. We wanted to just make it as simple as possible for those producers to register. As we move into reporting, the subsidiaries will be required to report their data. So this number will increase as we start to move towards those individual subsidiaries of the parent companies reporting directly. We have broken out as well priority registrations So we did look at producers with over 2 billion in global revenue. And so we have had 359 of those priority, which is 72% of those that we have tried to target as to what we saw as priority producers registered. So we're making, I think, good ground on that side to capture, again, all levels of producers that are required to report in. We are still, or register. We are still working, the team is still working to ensure that all producers are registered. But we do understand that there are some companies that are still looking to get additional feedback, potentially internally from their legal. And so we know that there has been some back and forth happening on that side. I'm happy to stop there and take any questions that folks might have.
Thanks, Pete. Any questions for Pete on producer registration?
Okay. So it's coming along well. I would say, we have done, there are Canadian jurisdictions that do post their producer registration. Again, it's not necessarily apples to apples when we look between jurisdictions. Ontario, as an example, has about, I think it's about 1,500 overall producers that are registered. It's a larger population than Colorado. But we do know that potentially there are more producers, more brands that are operating within the United States. And so we would expect potentially some difference there. There's differences in Ontario as well because local governments are captured as well as some government entities. And so there's some difference in the amount that are reporting on that side as well. Okay, next slide. So there was a couple of follow-up items that I thought I would just provide quick updates on. Scott, I think you had brought this up in a couple of meetings ago around the concern about glass being on the priority materials targeted list. And there was some questions about why it was being put on that. The focus was on simply improving the cleanup of glass at MRFs or secondary processors, again, to improve the quality of available materials. That was the focus. It wasn't on the need to create additional end markets for that. It was just really around materials that would be available. Cost funding formula for reimbursement for collectors. There was some questions about whether it was possible for us or is possible for us to set up different potential reporting or reimbursement approach, whether that be yearly, quarterly, or monthly. So we are still looking for feedback on that and also looking at our own IT system and what it will be able to manage. There seems to be, based on the feedback that we've received from producers or from, service providers, more of a preference towards more regular, so monthly reporting for reimbursement payments, but we are still looking at what the opportunities are within our own system to potentially accommodate different forms, whether that be, again, quarterly or yearly. But I think we've heard very strongly from a number that they would like to see those payments happening more frequently. On the question around market clearing price and the regions that might be included for those regions, we are currently having ongoing conversations with a number of waste collectors and haulers within the state. We are working through their trade associations as well to get more feedback on this to try to confirm those areas. So we still are in the midst of those conversations with those parties to try to provide more clarity around those regions or areas that we would use to set that market clearing price. So I know the team has met with a number of providers over the last few weeks. I think they did so through recently through the National Waste and Recycling Association. They've also had conversations through SWANA. So there has been a number of conversations on that side, and I think the team is looking to sort of take that feedback and start to come back with a more refined approach for the program plan. For service provider collaborations, this was a question around the question of, could the approach that we're taking have more of a focus around how compostable materials are collected and potentially separated out. So we are, again, internally having a discussion on this. It is more difficult because really our funding is meant to be based on the actual compost facility, and providing more of the sort of focus on the compost facility side, but we are still looking internally at how we might be able to address some of those concerns that have come up around how do we provide more incentive to reduce the contaminations that are coming in the first place. And I think that speaks to, I think, some of the comments you've made, Clint, over the last number of months. For PCO, oh, sorry, Clinton, go ahead.
Clinton Sander, A1 Organics. No, I was just affirming your statement by saying yes.
For post-consumer recycled content, we are, and so there was a question that was asked about whether we would do a material-specific consultations. The team has been meeting with some of the trade associations to get more feedback around post-consumer recycled content. So I know they have been meeting with some of the material-specific areas to get more feedback. I don't have it in this set of presentations, but I know we have, I have gotten now a spreadsheet of all of the responses on the session, the consultation session that we ran on post-consumer recycled content. So there is a fair amount of additional feedback that's provided by some of the different industries that are involved in these areas to give us more feedback around how do we set those post-consumer recycled content thresholds more closely. So those conversations are happening. And as I said, we're summarizing the feedback that we've received as part of the consultation sessions to make sure that we've captured and addressed the comments that are coming back to us.
Pete, you want to pause here just to see if there's any quick questions or clarifications? Okay, Rick and then Scott.
Rick Cater, Swordfish Consulting, Murphs. This relates to collections in particular in the open market or market clearing price regions. During the group meeting in Boulder with Recycle Colorado, we brought up the idea of whether or not there were you had any intention of supporting small business or minority business collectors in particular, by allowing a certain percentage of the bids to be aligned like the old days with as a percent for small business or minority business enterprise. Are you considering that?
So I know the team is having conversations on that. It does add some complication in how we move forward, but I think we are certainly looking at ways to ensure that we're supporting a robust competitive marketplace. So I know the team is discussing that, but I don't know, Rick, I don't think we've got necessarily a set position on it yet, but we are having discussion. There is always a concern if the approach we take is going to limit opportunities. And so there's always a concern, I think, as you move forward with some of these mechanisms of how do we ensure that all players have a reasonable access to compete within the marketplace.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Rick and Pete. Scott, and then Chris.
Yes, Scott, the 5 Jeep glass packaging. Pete, I just wanted to double check that I think we've had at least one of the conversations with glass on PCR content. I just want to make sure that we were in sync and had not missed follow up or anything like that. But I know we've had some preliminary discussions on PCR.
Yes, I think so. I will follow up, Scott,
Okay.
just to double check. I'll just check with the team, but I know that there have been conversations on the plastic side, on the metal side, the glass side, and as I said, we're just pulling in all of the comments that we've received on PCR. I think we had 40 survey responses, and I would say there is a fair amount of difference in the feedback that we've received in some of those areas. So there may be a need for the team as well to double back based on some of the feedback that they've received in the areas. So
Yeah, I think it's one of those issues that's relatively new in the glass world about where to measure, how to measure, and we're getting a lot of incoming questions also about how to respond to the surveys. But just like before, when we were in the needs assessment phase, sometimes I'm giving my feedback right here, but I don't necessarily always fill out a survey behind that. So I just wanted to make sure we were syncing on that.
yeah, and Scott, I think what I would say is, as we have conversations as a team, not all of those are going to be necessarily through the surveys. So the team is feeding that information back into the consolidation of feedback that we receive. So that fits, I think Scott and Darla had mentioned earlier about the feedback that comes back through this committee. There is the feedback as well that we receive as part of those surveys. There's also individual conversations that are happening. So we're trying to take all of that and feed it back into our summaries. The other thing I would be remiss to forget to mention is, I know we have received some comments back from trade associations, from producers, from service providers who have missed a date. So they have not got back to us on the survey in the timeline that's indicated. Those timelines were set because we want to try to make sure that we're feeding information and summarizing it and using it to build the program plan. But we're never going to refuse additional feedback. So encourage any of those. If you've missed a deadline, we will still accept your feedback and make sure that it's reflected within the survey or within the consolidation of feedback. So please would encourage any of those that may be in that situation to again send the information through to us still.
Okay, thank you,
Chris.
Scott. Pete, Chris, did you have a comment? Your hand went down, but I just wanted to check in with you.
Yeah. Hi, Scott. Thanks. Chris Howes, Colorado Retail Council. Pete, do you mind going back to the first slide there? Sorry to slow you down, but
No,
I just
no problem.
thinking about, the part of this total registrations, I think made me feel pretty good. And then I started thinking about priority registrations. Are we saying that there's still a quarter of priority producers who have not yet registered and they're past the deadline? Because my members, I'm pretty darn sure all of them have signed up appropriately. Are we saying there's a quarter in the industry who have not yet signed up? Am I reading that right?
Yeah, I think there's certainly those that we've identified that could potentially be producers, Chris. So there may very well, some of them may not be producers. We've identified them as potentially producers, and maybe they do not supply into Colorado. We don't have a sight line into, but we started with a list that said, here's producers or companies with over 3 or 2 billion in global revenue. And so we want to make sure that we are targeting these companies to make sure that they're registered. And again, they may not be necessarily the producer. There could be an importer that's involved there.
Yeah.
And I need to check with the team, but there may be some of that question too, where there might be a parent company that is registering on behalf of multiple subsidiaries. One of those subsidiaries is included under that under that number. So again, the team is doing its best to make sure that we're covering all of those, but again, there may be some slippage there as well.
Yeah, got it. All right, thanks. I just want to make sure that all the companies that should be signing up are signing up. It's pretty important to our membership that everybody enjoy the responsibility of signing up. So, all right, thanks, Scott.
And Chris, if I might just add, I mean, obviously our work continues. We're still, the team is still out pushing those additional companies who might be registered to make sure that they are either clear with us that they're not a designated producer, or they are. We are getting them onboarded. So there's a lot of push on that side to get them on board.
Good. That's good to hear. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Chris, for your interest and responsibility for the companies that you work with. All right, Pete, next slide, please.
I think I presented this slide already. I mean, we've, oh, sorry, Gail, go ahead.
Gail?
Nope. Yeah, sorry about that. Thank you, Gail, Gary, City of Steamboat Springs, City Council. I did have just kind of one follow-up question. What is the anticipated timeline for publishing the list of producers?
I need to double check with the team as to sort of what, but I would imagine that would likely be in the next couple of weeks, Gail. I know we've been having some discussion with CDPHE. I think ideally we want just a formal letter so that we can, it's clear to the producers that this is required. And we will send all of that information over to CDPHE. And then it'll be posted on, I think CDPHE will be posting it as well as we'll be posting it on our website as well. So I know there's some work happening right now just to make sure that everything's cleaned up and properly put together before it gets posted.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, Gail. Okay, seeing no other hands, Pete, please.
Okay. So I think, as I said, I think we've had some of this discussion already. I think we've had very good participation rates and attendance on all of our consultation sessions. We are now, as I mentioned, started to get to that point where we provide 30 days for attendees or people that registered for the event to fill out the surveys. So we're now sort of closing those off. We are summarizing all of those sessions. So that information is starting to come back to us as to the responses on all of those. I think, and Yuri, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the final one, I think the last day for that 30-day period, I think ends on October the 18th. So we'll have all of them, I think, wrapped up and summarized by that point. And then, as I said, as we're moving forward, we're taking that feedback and looking to make adjustments to the program plan and ensure that we've addressed the feedback that we've received. So the next few slides really get into just sort of what the feedback, what the makeup of those consultation sessions are. So I'm going to provide just a bit of an overview of what we've heard back as part of those sessions. This information just reflects what we received back, the feedback we received in those sessions, and the comments we've received back from the survey. It doesn't include the comments we received here at the advisory board, and it doesn't include some of those individual meetings we've had. That will be reflected, but again, we've just summarized it in what happened in those sessions so far. Next slide over. So I've taken a similar process for each of these slides. The first slide includes just a pie graph on the attendees by the type of attendees that participated, and the next one shows by region as to so in each of the sessions we asked them to self-identify. What type of attendee are they? And then where are they located? So it just gives you a bit of a summary. I won't spend a lot of time on that, but I just thought it might be interesting for the group to just see what the makeup of the attendance was. We've talked about the first two sessions. So this deals with the third session that we ran that was specifically on producer dues. We received about 70 questions as part of that initial of that session. A lot of those questions really dealt with producers trying to understand their responsibilities and whether they were caught under the legislation. And then we received 20 responses back on the surveys that we've received. The focus of the questions by producers, again, really was around that assistance with reporting and registration. So lots of different types of questions around when selling to distributors who might not necessarily deliver products in the state, who is actually the responsible party, what are the covered materials? There still has been a number of questions about what are covered materials, what is caught under the act and what isn't. I'll just mention we have just recently released some additional guidance that was provided before the deadline to talk about some of those issues, to talk about what covered materials are captured, what are the producer definitions in both Colorado and Oregon, to make sure that producers more clearly understand their obligations. So that includes it includes examples of different types of situations, where you might have a producer that is outside of North America. They're supplying through an importer, and that importer is then in the United States, but then providing to a retailer. And so it's a question of who is the responsible party in that situation. So we've tried to provide clarity for a bunch of different types of examples, products that are being sold with packaging associated with them, publishers, food serviceware, to try to provide different examples to help different companies understand their obligations. This will be a living document. So what was published will be updated on a regular basis. So as more examples come through where there might be complications of, a brand that is licensed by another party, who is the actual actual producer of that material within the hierarchy. So we're trying to provide, as we get those examples in, as many examples as possible to help companies ensure that they clearly understand who should be registering and who should be reporting. And I'll just mention as well, there were a number of questions in this about reporting. And the second half of our session, we're going to be talking about reporting categories, because we are working right now to ensure that we can provide clear reporting guidance by the end of the year, because producers will be reporting to us next year on the first 6 months of next year. And so we want to make sure ahead of time that they've got an understanding of what are the categories that we're going to be asking for information on, so that they can report that information in. So that work is happening internally right now with the team to make sure that we develop that reporting guidance as well. Next slide over. So there seemed to be general support for the base dues approach that we had proposed as part of that session, but there was definitely questions around examples and details. And there was definitely quite a bit of feedback around ensuring that the materials that might be more difficult to recycle face higher dues. We did have some concerns that were raised about federally regulated products. So one of the examples being tobacco products that are have quite a bit of requirements around how that packaging must be designed. And so their concern was, that they're heavily regulated as to what their packaging must look like and how it must be labeled. And so a concern that they didn't have much choice in how they were currently packaging their materials. We did get some comments as well on reusables. And again, there was a question, I think, from some people as to whether they would be deemed as covered materials, and if they were deemed as covered materials, that those producers only pay once when their material is actually provided. So that I think the concern was, as reusable material gets recirculated in the economy, they shouldn't be paying each rotation that material comes through. There was some support for the idea of flat fees, but there was an interest in getting more information back on how flat fees might work. And so I think I mentioned this before. Some of the concern around setting flat fees fits around sort of understanding what the current what's currently being supplied by different sets of companies. So as we get information back from producers on what is actually being supplied, based on the curve of materials, we may be able to better set out what should be a low volume producer that a flat fee may make sense for, where it's really just an administrative cost. And so we're just trying to understand that. We may have some examples too within Colorado where a producer may have zero material that they supplied into the marketplace in the year before. And so they are supplying material moving forward. And so there may be, again, a desire to have a flat fee associated with a producer that we are registering into the marketplace that is supplying, but hasn't, obviously for the previous year, which is the data we use to allocate fees or dues, that information may not be there. Chris?
Did you want to, yeah. Chris, go ahead.
Yeah, Peter, Chris House, Colorado Retail Council. Just wondering if there was discussions about when the dues would change every year, every quarter, every month. I assume they'll be modulated. Maybe you're getting to that. So just had a question about when those dues might be changed.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, dues would be set on an annual basis, and they would be changed on an annual basis. So we would, the schedule currently we have right now is producers would report, I think, once we get to a more regular cadence, producers will report in May, and the fees would be announced by November. And so there would be that standard that people could expect. This is how, this is when fees will be set. This is when reporting will happen, so that companies can better plan moving forward as to what their potential costs might be. And on that, Chris, I think we did get quite a bit of comments around ensuring that there's transparency around the due setting process. So making sure that it's clear to people as to the process that they understand. So we are working on materials around that as well as we look to the program plan to give people confidence in, here's where the dues are going to be set. There's going to be opportunity for comments. How is that process going to work? How is that information going to be available to stakeholders so they understand how those dues are getting set, posting all of that type of thing. Again, there were some questions around definitions and timing, and so we are working to sort of create more of a robust explanation on how that will work. There has been some concerns from producers around too much emphasis on weight of materials. So certain materials we know are heavier within a system. And so how do the fees get adjusted based on the fact that you might have flexible materials that are quite lightweight and glass materials that are much heavier, or aluminum as compared to, you know, some of the paper products that could be heavier. So certainly some feedback on that side. And then there were a number of eco-modulation questions and comments that were included as part of this presentation. We are moving all of those comments over to the feedback on the eco-modulation session so that we lump those all together. I didn't include them as part of this slide just because it just made sense to include them all as part of that specific session. And I'll stop there briefly just to see if there's any additional comments or questions. Hearing none, I'll move to the next sort of summary of sessions. Session 4 dealt with compost. We did receive 33 questions back, and we had 25 survey responses that we received back. The questions and feedback in the session focused on the need to provide information to producers on compostable labeling requirements, which obviously the recent legislation dealt with, as well as end product certification requirements. There was a fair amount of response back around clarifying how producer dues compare for recyclable versus compostable packaging. So what does that look like? And then clarify if depackaging for food, for wasted food would qualify for reimbursement if the packaging could be recovered. Next slide. So in the survey comments back, the comments we received on funding included there was a fair amount of focus on the need to be technology agnostic and equitable. And by equitable, I mean ensuring that there is equal opportunity for large and small compost facilities to potentially receive funding, and the need for the funding to focus on outcomes, ensuring that more materials potentially could be processed, and that, you know, those facilities were achieving quality compost from them. Allow for funding for existing and new infrastructure. So there was this question of, is this available potentially for new infrastructure that potentially might be built? There seemed to be some preference towards more of an incentive-based model. And again, we did have a bit of comments. Some preferred more of a capital fund. But if you look at the predominance of comments, they seem to be more towards an incentive-based approach. And then again, around could funding support collection, so reducing the contamination. I think I spoke to that earlier as well in some of the comments. And there was definitely a desire for ensuring that reporting allowed for simplicity. Could we rely on the reporting that that compost facilities are already doing through CDPHE, rather than a new requirement that may be costly for compost facilities. On contamination measurement, there was some suggestion for the need to include laboratory testing to identify persistent products, so products that may not be properly breaking down within the process, or potentially that may be leading to issues with different chemical issues within the compost itself. The need for a standardized list of contamination, so clearly what is considered contamination and how we might classify the different types of contamination in there. There was some consideration that we should look at measuring by weight contamination. We did also receive some feedback around the potential for camera AI scans to be used as well to identify contamination within compost. comments on measuring at collection and at the tipping at the facility. There was some highlights around considering seasonal differences. Obviously, different times of the year, you may get an influx of different types of materials. So in the fall time, given you're collecting a lot of leaf and yard waste, you may have lower amounts of potential contamination versus other times of the year when you don't have that material. And there was another comment just around considering facility resources. So there is a difference between a large facility and a small facility and what available staff time might be there. So that's something we should be considering as we put together what we're requiring around measurement, because all facilities may not be able to achieve the same levels given what resource they had. In addition, there was significant feedback on educational opportunities. I haven't included them on this slide, but there was a large list of different ways that we could approach reducing contamination within facilities. And then a focus on the need for producer dues to address hard to recycle food consumption items. So not necessarily specifically on compostable, but again, fitting in some of those concerns around materials that might be composted, even though they're not necessarily supposed to be. I'll stop. Clint, go ahead.
Well, it's Clinton Sander, A1 Organics Compost Manufacturing Seed. One thing that scares me is the measure by weight for contamination, just because the volume of lightweight plastics, and which is the top of the most common contaminant. If you're measuring that by weight, that's can be significantly less versus volume. So I just want to make sure that that's really clear. And you had just mentioned, Peter, significant feedback on educational opportunities, which I 100% agree with. But then after you had said that statement, you said at the facility, and it sounded like you said significant educational opportunities at the facility compost manufacturer for contamination reduction? Or are you talking about upstream at the generator level?
If I said at the facility, I didn't mean to say at the facility. Sometimes my mouth keeps moving and I don't always fully mean to say what I say. That's probably the wrong way to say it. No, I think the educational opportunities were more focused on the actual collector side. So it was lots of feedback on how do we make sure that there is more information to the people that are engaging on the collection side to reduce the materials that may be contamination that they're putting into the bins. So I think it was more along those lines around what we heard. And I will be very clear when I talk about the feedback that we've received. These are not necessarily what CAA supports. They are not necessarily what CAA supports. I just wanted to reflect back the comments that we had heard during those sessions. So where there was differences, and there were definitely some differences in what we heard back around the approach for measuring contamination. I just wanted to make sure that I was reflecting those back in the comments that that I was providing back to the group.
Gotcha. And then one more question I had.
Yeah.
In mind. Was there any feedback or any questions asking about would the funding through the EPR actually support the required infrastructure to manage the compostables? Because a lot of what I see here is going to require significant funding, and I know the compostables at this moment are not a high volume type material within the overall picture of the EPR. So I'm just wondering if any of that type of questions came up within any of this feedback session.
And you're going to need to reword the question for me one more time.
Okay.
Sorry, Clinton. I heard would, and then do you mean? Yeah.
My question was,
sorry.
Within any of the feedback sessions related to compostable packaging, did any of that feedback address or ask questions around the amount of funding that the EPR will produce associated with the volume of packaging to actually support the type of infrastructure required to manage them in this way?
It did. There was some questions on that side, Clinton, as to what the expected revenue would be from producers. And I know internally we're trying to do some work on that side to try to work out how much we expect. The data on how much certified compostable material making its way into the marketplace is not well understood. So we are looking for as many data sources as we can to try to figure out how do we try to establish a budget for this and try to understand what that potential rate might be. I don't have a solid answer on that one, Clinton, yet. We've got additional resources that are being spent to try to better understand that side of the marketplace.
Okay, thank you.
And sorry, just on weight, I would say, I mean, however we measure, I think the idea measurement when it comes to contaminants is where are we starting and what are we doing to improve the trajectory around where we go. So I take the concern, which is, we don't want to get lost in the fact that whatever 10% may not seem like a lot. It does have a big impact on what the quality of the product that's being produced is. So I don't think we want it, like, the idea is not to get lost on that side. It's just more of a question around what's the easiest way for companies to be able to measure what's being picked up on that side, and that we as an organization show the trajectory is heading in the right way. The steps that we are taking are reducing the amount of covered materials that may be making their way into compost facilities. Sorry, and I should say non-compostable covered materials into compost facilities.
Well, I think a recommendation or a thought process to think about would be just not isolating it to one unit of measurement.
Yeah. So, and Clint, I would say that's a fair point, and that may fit to some degree some of the comments we received. Some people, it may be easier to measure in a different way. Some may be easier to measure in weight, but we still need something that tries to bring that together. I think we are also internally discussing, could we as well work through a third party and so have CA do some of that, or get some of those audits done through a third party to make sure that there is some level of consistency that's applied across the board to different facilities. So maybe, we on an annual basis assess, a part of the compost facilities. So each year we would do a different set, and those compost facilities may still report as well, but there's different levels of rigor that potentially could be applied to make sure that we're getting a good number that provides a better sense as to whether we're headed in the right direction or not.
Got it. Thank you.
Okay, Pete, we got 4 more slides here. I think we're going to try to take a break around 1:45, 1:50 if we can. So somewhere in there.
Okay, my apologies. I'm slow on these ones, so.
No problem. Good questions. Thank you.
So next slide over. So session 5 dealt with, it was our first reimbursement session that really focused on collection. We had 31 questions during that session and 14 survey responses that were received back. Now, I'm going to add a provision around this because I know we have heard from some of the trade associations and some of the individual members that we may get consolidated comments back from the sector that would get built into this as well. Lots of questions during this session. How hauling and reimbursement will deal with drop-off sites. So where you may be collecting one material in a separate bin, how would that be addressed? And so we are certainly looking at a different reimbursement model for those materials, a market clearing price, but would be set in a slightly different way. How haulers will be reimbursed under the two proposed approaches for collecting specific materials. And again, so if a hauler might be collecting a glass only bin or an OCC only bin, how would they be compensated? And again, I think we would be looking potentially towards a separate pricing that would be included for that. They wanted additional details on how CA plans to manage currently active contracts between haulers and local governments regarding who is going to be responsible for rate setting. So where does CA get potentially involved in that relationship and billing and reimbursement timelines? So I know that the team has been meeting with some separate municipalities as well as with some of the service providers to have some discussions around how some of those issues might be dealt with. Clarify about hauling services, what hauling services are eligible for reimbursement, cart or bag-based recycling. So how you deal with different types of hauling services that might be provided that might be different. Next slide. So lots of different feedback that we received on both sets of reimbursement for both collection and the processing side. But for collection, you know, if they were to move towards, so there was a push. Sorry, there was some advocacy towards CA providing a preference towards a single hauler vendor in municipalities. And the rationale was really around how do we reduce greenhouse gas emissions by not having 5 trucks run down a road, by just having 1 truck run down the road. That we need to take into account the costs associated with worker safety, participation rates, lower contamination rates. So how do we ensure that the pricing that we're providing isn't just dissenting the lowest cost denominator? How do we make sure that we build in some of the requirements into it? There was lots of discussion around ensuring that recyclers are able to maintain margins and even on the nonprofit side, so they can reinvest back into their systems. There was a number of concerns about the move to weekly collection in the Front Range. So some concerns around service providers that may not be able to necessarily even have the trucks in place to be able to meet that requirement at the outset. Definitely lots of discussion around the fact that the diversity of Colorado's geography needing to be taken into account in reimbursement, where you may have even parts of the Front Range that might have might be more remote, or again, some of those geographic conditions that make some of those areas more difficult to service. Lots of discussion around the simplicity in reporting. Obviously, some of these collectors and haulers may not have complicated systems that are in place, and so there was a concern about them being able to provide the necessary reporting that CA might want to see. Lots of comments around the need for greater clarity around what the expectations that CA may have on collectors, the timeline for reimbursement, and when a reassessment of compensation rates would be considered. So as we start to move potentially into periods of time when you might have greater market volatility, how do we ensure that those service providers have confidence in investing in the economy? How do we look at incentives around to encourage lower contamination rates? And this one comes up again in the processor one around how do we make sure that the collectors are not just collecting any materials, that there aren't TVs and mattresses included in people's recycling, that there's some level of scrutiny that's been applied. The need potentially for different ways to promote health and safety. So there was some discussion around collectors needing to report on health and safety on a regular basis, to ensure that they had regular or appropriate levels of insurance in place. There was a bit of a push for automated collection by some players. There was an indication that processors should be the ones that reimburse the haulers. So instead of CA paying haulers and processors, just pay processors, and then they would flow the funds down to the collectors. And then there was some concerns raised around, I sort of dealt with that one already, around contamination. Next slide. And I'm not going fast enough, so I apologize, Scott. Reimbursement 2 dealt with the processor reimbursement. We did receive 31 questions, and we only had 6 survey responses back. Probably not. I mean, there is probably less processors than collectors, so that may be reasonable. And we have, as I said, heard that the trade associations will likely provide consolidated responses back, but again, a lower rate than we would have liked to have seen. Questions in the session talked about, determining how rejected loads would be incorporated or not incorporated into the reimbursement model. Additional details on what MRFs need to report on for reimbursement. Again, around things like material transfer, where they may be doing a small sort and then sending materials to another facility. And then lots of questions around a reasonable margin, around what processors might expect as a reasonable margin back on the rates that they were going to receive. Next slide. Again, lots of difference in feedback that we received. There were some comments around providing financial incentives, consider providing financial incentives to close infrastructure gaps and ensure that we're producing higher quality materials. So making sure that the reimbursement takes some of those things into account. And I think that's something certainly we need to look at, because it's part of our requirements in the legislation. There seemed to be general support for the request for information approach, and then moving to some sort of individual negotiation with each of the MRFs. So there was I think an agreement that each of the MRFs does have differences in what they're doing and how they're set up, so that there was a need to potentially look at those individually. General agreement, but still some questions and concerns about removing tip fees from collectors. So instead of those MRFs charging a tip fee to their processors, or their collectors, that they would simply take those materials. Again, I think processors want to make sure that the cost or the reimbursement they're going to get is going to include the upgrades that they may need to make, incentive for collectors to reduce the contamination, and there is a need to make sure that they can still charge for commercial materials that might be coming through their facilities. The most significant concerns related to, again, ensuring fair, open, and competitive markets. A concern around being forced to take materials that might impact their current markets. So I think, Rick, that fits with some of the comments we've had as part of the group around things like flexibles, where they may not be able to generally take those types of materials, and that might impact their paper bales or other materials. Tracking commingled materials as to what is covered or not. So if they're receiving a load of materials that might include business-to-business materials, how would they potentially take that into account around reimbursement, rejected loads, which I've spoken to earlier. And again, I think there's certainly some concerns that were raised by some of the local smaller facilities around how do we ensure that those facilities aren't just getting forgotten as part of the system. There seemed to be a general preference for the sort of processor agreement. So if we're looking at MRF upgrades, doing that through doing that through the arrangement that's in place between the processor and CAA, as opposed to a capital investment type or a capital fund type of an approach. But again, I would say there is some difference. We did hear, I think, some preference by some of the municipal folks more towards that capital fund that we need to keep into mind as we go forward. Next slide, Scott.
And here we have some, if there's a couple of questions before the break, let's go for it.
Close to on time, but
great. Good job, Pete. Thank you. A lot of information here to convey. Not seeing any hands, so then let's take a 5-minute break here, and over to you, Brandon.
Thanks, Scott. Members of the public, the chat is now open. So if you'd like to sign up to speak during our public comment period, please send a chat to hosts and panelists with your full name and your organizational affiliation. I'll keep the chat function open until the public comment period begins. I do just want to remind folks that the public comment period during our advisory board meetings is not a time to ask questions, but rather to provide your feedback. If you have questions, please email them to eprcomments@state.co.us, which I've also just put into the chat. We reply to each and every email that we receive. Board members, please be mindful of the time and return promptly, and we'll see everyone back here in 5 minutes.
right, thank you, Brandon, for that lovely music. Starting us up again, eh? All right,
Too
welcome
excited.
back. Welcome back, everyone. I want to just let you know that we will have one public comment period today, which will take place at the end of the next discussion topic. And that will be provided and presented here by Pete again. And he's going to discuss reporting categories. So Pete, over to you.
Well, maybe if I can ask the question first before we move on, what is the bird of the month or and is this a native to Colorado?
Who is the who has put this the lovely bird in here? Megan, do you know?
Yes,
Is this...
that was me, and I did know the name. It's some type of grouse, and it is native to Colorado.
It's a sage grouse. I think they're technically endangered or threatened. This is Becca.
Thanks, Becca. I was wondering it the whole time we were meeting, so I probably that's helpful. Thank you. Okay, reporting categories. So just if we move one slide forward, good. I'm not allowed out of my office very often, but the team that is on the ground talking to producers on a regular basis, one of the most common questions we get is around reporting and how are producers going to be reporting across multiple different states. So this is something that the team is facing on a regular basis, which is the desire for producers to want to know more information about what is actually going to be needed to be reported as part of their requirements in each of the states. Typically, there is generally a push for harmonization between states. Producers want to be reporting the same information and track the same information around what they need to report in the same way. So they're not getting forced to create 12 different categories or however many different categories between different states. At this point right now, there are different obligated materials, there are different exemptions, there are different requirements in each of the states. In California, they are setting the reporting categories, so we have no ability to be able to change that. And there are differences between some of the requirements around collection in Oregon to Colorado. So there are differences in place. So we understand that there is some inevitability that there are going to be differences between the states. And so what we have tried to do as a team is work through how do we allow for mapping of categories across different states to make it as simple as possible for producers to understand the data they need to capture so that they can report into each of the individual states. And I'll talk about this in a little bit more detail in the upcoming slides. Next slide over. So the way that we've approached creating the list for Colorado was we started with Oregon. Oregon was to some degree ahead of Colorado in its lists. So we took Oregon's reporting categories. We mapped those materials against the minimum recyclables list, the additional materials list, the covered materials lists, essentially, that we had started as part of the needs assessment to create as much alignment as possible. We did remove some of the additional specificity that was required in Oregon that was not required in Colorado. And then in Colorado, we had to add in potential reporting categories that were required in Colorado, but not in Oregon. So for example, in Colorado, we have requirements around certified compostables. And I don't know whether that beeping is meaning I need to do something, but So certified compostables is something different than in Oregon. So we needed to create separate categories for Colorado that dealt with paper certified by the ASTM standard, plastic and polymer coated substances that fit, again, the specific ASTM standard, and rigid and flexible plastics that met the certified ASTM or equivalent standard. So we had to create separate categories for those in Colorado to make sure that we had set those out. So that led to the list of materials that is on the right-hand side of your screen. We've tried to break this out in a few different ways. So the next slides, if we move one slide forward, we've broken these out around plastic rigid, flexible other. So we've given you an idea as to what's included in each. And I know I received a question from Scott about what the colors meant. The colors are just more meant to try to make it easier to separate out the materials. The colors don't mean anything. We've tried to address by whether there's boxes around each, whether they're on the minimum recyclables list, the additional materials list, or not on either. So we've tried to sort of define them more clearly on this slide. But these are the categories that we have set up for rigid flexible, rigid, plastic, flexible, plastic. And then we've included a separate category around other plastic that might include small format plastics, so things like candy wrappers, and plastic packaging associated with hazardous or special products. So that would be things like what the Lubricant Packaging Manufacturers Association, hopefully I've got that right, is going to be speaking about when they talk about an individual program plan. We've tried to separate those materials out into a separate category. Next slide. Again, we have separate categories for paper and fiber packaging and food serviceware, for paper products, for metal, for glass and ceramics. And again, I'll talk specifically as to how these differ from the covered material categories that we had initially spoke to. Next slide over. And then we have a certified compostable packaging category and a wood and other organics. So that would include things like textiles as well in that category that would be potentially included as well. So everything from clementine boxes to burlap sacks that coffee might be provided in.
Pete, there's a comment from Clinton that I'd like Clinton, if you can unmute and or just I can say, can we or you remove the problem solvers on the screen?
We're good.
It's been done.
All right. Got it.
Okay. I don't think that was me. I didn't know what it meant either. So, if we just move to the next slide, what I wanted to do is just walk through. So there are some differences, as I mentioned, with the covered materials list that was in the needs assessment and the proposed reporting categories. So the table over the next, I think, 3 slides runs through what some of those differences are. So, and please stop me if you want to discuss any of these specifically, and I can try to provide at least some of the explanation and rationale. So low-grade printing and writing paper, we had as a separate category in the needs assessment. For the proposed reporting category, we are looking at including that as in a bulk category that will include other printed paper. And again, I think when the team looked at it, it didn't make sense to have as many categories as we had. These types of materials will flow through facilities in a similar way. And so we thought it made sense to keep it in one category. We also had a separate category in the needs assessment for magazines and other coated paper and for bound directories. As part of the proposed reporting categories, we had created one category that would deal with magazines, catalogs, and directories. So all of those materials would be pushed into one specific category. For wax-coated corrugated cardboard, we have moved that into other paper laminates. Again, similar types of issues with that material around its recyclability. For molded pulp packaging and molded pulp food serviceware, we moved those categories into other paper packaging. So it's a bit of a larger category. But again, I think what we tried to do is simplify those into one category. Paper cups, we've moved into a category that deals with polycoated paperboard. So all different types of polycoated paperboard. Gable top and aseptic containers we have included as one category as aseptic and gable top cartons. I know this has been an area of discussion, I think, in previous. I think we've heard from stakeholders both ways. This is the way that it is captured in a lot of other jurisdictions as one category. Non-metallized gift wrapped would be dealt with under other paper packaging. Paper cans, so spiral wound containers, would be dealt with under other paper laminates as well. And we are just in the process of trying to map out where we are going to place paper tea bags. We have still need to do a bit of work on that side, but we're looking at what category it makes most sense to fit under. Next slide. Clear PET thermoform containers and colored opaque PET thermoform containers, we're moving that under PET, other rigid containers, cups, lids, plates, trays, and tubs. For white EPS, colored EPS, so we have created some different categories to deal with polystyrene. So we have a polystyrene expanded foam, hinged containers, plates, cups, tubs, trays, and other foam containers. We have a separate category for other expanded foam forms, and then a category for polystyrene rigid non-expanded. So those are the categories that we've moved to. Again, we are trying as much as possible to create categories to capture all of the various types of materials that potentially would make their way into the system. For PLA, PHA, PHB, non-certified compostable materials, we're looking to address those under a reporting category for other mixed rigid plastics. PE squeezable tubes, we would deal with either based on what they're composed of, the resin type, HDPE, other rigid items, or LDPE, other rigid items. And then we have potentially a mix of other materials, multi-material films, PLA, PHA, plastic film that's non-certified, PVC film, PET film, PP woven bags, and plastic tea bags. We have a category that's plastic laminates and other flexible plastic packaging that we're looking to include all of those products under. Next slide. Polypropylene nursery containers, we are looking to consider that under a polypropylene containers, cups, lids, plates, trays, and tubs. Paint containers, motor oil, solvent, or pesticide containers, we're looking to consolidate that under that category I mentioned earlier for plastic packaging, hazardous or special products. And then wood packaging and textile packaging, as I mentioned, we'd have a wood and other organics category that would be applied. So in total, we've moved to what would be 51 reporting categories. And maybe if I can ask Brandon to just move back to those initial slides, these ones. So one more forward. Actually, it's actually right there. If you just stay on that last slide, 25, Brandon, that would be great. So we have 51 categories in total. that we're looking to have producers report on. There is one question mark that we still have for newspapers around whether we need a newspaper category. So we are still having a discussion on that one and looking for feedback. We do already have a newsprint category for that. But again, we're trying to look to create categories that would allow greater ease for producers to report into. So again, many of the categories that we've talked about, we've tried to consolidate. We've also tried to make sure that we are capturing all of the various types of packaging materials or food serviceware or service packaging that's potentially out there to make sure they fit and we can map them into each of these individual categories. If we move forward now, Bren. One more. So the reason that we're pushing, I think, on this particularly today is producers are required to report to us by August of 2025. So the concern is that this is likely going to, our need to inform producers is going to become before the final program plan is approved. So we need to provide advice out to producers ahead of time, likely by the end of this year, so that they know what information they need to capture and report on, again, looking into August of next year. So reporting for the first 6 months of 2025. So we are looking to provide that list to them this year and make sure that they have time to be able to, again, ensure that their systems are able to collect the information that we are asking for in those reporting categories. So this is, to some degree, somewhat of an awkward conversation because I know we don't have an approved program plan, and there obviously could be changes that might be recommended to this, but we are really looking to reach out to the advisory board ahead of time to say, we need to get this information out to producers before the end of the year so that they can start capturing the information and tracking the information as part of this. So we are looking as much as possible to, is there any major issues? Is there any major concerns that you might have with the categories that are being proposed? And do you have any specific questions about how those categories are being set up? And I think the next slide is questions, but maybe I'll stop and see if there's questions first from the group as to how the categories have been set up and where, if there's any questions around concerns about how those categories have been established.
All right, time for some questions from the advisory board. Darla, I know you're with several people there. So please.
Yeah, good afternoon. Michael Pratt, Sunoco, producer of recycled packaging, paper packaging. My first question is really just around definitions, or do we have existing definitions for these material categories that are being proposed?
So we're just in the process of putting all of those together. So we're looking, Michael, at a guidance document that will include definitions for each of the product categories, as well as examples that would be included for each of these. And then, any potential reporting advice that might come with nuances that might be associated with those materials and how producers might report them.
Okay, makes sense. Yeah, I think right now it's a little bit difficult for me to provide exact input. I think there's a lot of nuances. I'm completely on board with like harmonizing, simplifying, but I think, how those are defined, I think some of these formats may be better fits in other categories, but I think seeing that guidance document would be helpful. I think my second question is just how will this tie into recycling acceptance list, or will it at all?
I think we've tried to line it up as much as possible with the acceptance list. There may be some reporting categories that might have some nuances to it, meaning there might be 90% of the materials that are on the accepted list, and there might be 10% that may not be. And this is one of the challenges that we're trying to figure out how to deal with, where we may have some materials that are included in the acceptance list in one jurisdiction, and potentially some of them not collected in another jurisdiction. And so I think we're working through the challenges on that side.
Okay. All right. Thanks. Yeah. I mean, just overall, I think just whenever that guidance document's available, I think just maybe eliciting feedback from converters potentially, or even producers themselves could be interesting, just to make sure those kind of formats that may not get top billing or may be a smaller percent of the material stream are just kind of put into the correct category. But nothing else for me right now.
Perfect. Thanks, Michael.
Caroline Mitchell, municipal representative. I think you already mostly answered this, Peter. I was wondering if any of these categories, if the lumping, if you will, of materials into categories would make any of the categories span minimum recyclable list and additional recyclables list. And it sounds like maybe some of them might, and I'm wondering if, from the perspective of the benefit of having things separate versus having them lumped together, it feels to me like there is benefit to keeping material categories sort of whole, if you will, on lists as much as possible. I'm hearing you that, the requirements in Oregon are different than Colorado, and but to the degree possible, at least from my lens, it feels like there would be benefit in making sure that the material categories can be clear which of the lists they're on as they're being reported.
Yeah, and I think we've tried, Carolyn, to set up the material, the categories as much as possible to make sure that they fit with those accepted lists. But there may be some categories where that may not be completely. There may be some nuances, right? You might have a jurisdiction that's not taking pulp food serviceware that format, but they're taking other formats. So they're taking, let's say, an egg carton that's a molded pulp, but they're not taking a pulp food serviceware container. So there's a difference between those two, but we only have one category for both of them. So there might be some differences in that. As we start to look at some of the nuances between the systems, it's very hard to not end up with, hundreds of reporting categories if we're to break it out in every single way based on each of the jurisdictions' requirements.
Well, maybe I can, Caroline Mitchell, municipal representative, maybe I can ask a slightly different version of the question. Yes, I'm assuming that the reporting categories are going to be sort of the baseline of information and a key tool in, say, items that are on the additional materials list where there might be investments to help get them more recyclable. If you have a category that includes some materials for which that's possible, this is a theoretical question, it may not be accurate, but say we lump a lot of the flexible film packaging together, and if some of the flexible film has sort of a pathway identified to get to recyclability and some of it doesn't, if that is reported in one category together, does that impact the ability to move, to sort of handle those materials separately, if you will, from an action sense? Did that make sense?
Yeah, no, it totally does. It totally does. No, it's a good question. I think there's always opportunities for us to improve or not improve, add to the categories, the reporting categories. So if there is a distinct pathway for, I don't know, PET film as compared to PVC film, then potentially we could look to break out those reporting categories moving forward. Right now, they're both in the same category right now. So we could look to break those categories up. I think the sense was starting with a simpler list when we have lots of producers right now that are terrified of what their reporting requirements are. I think was one of the objectives, to try to make it as simple as possible, even though it's going to be quite complicated. So I think, you know, in total right now we're mapping well over 100 categories between the three states, of different categories, and so that is going to add some complexity for producers.
Thank you for the question, Caroline, and Pete, the answers. So we'll go to Rick and then Gail.
Yes, I agree that to me, it's kind of, I understand that this list that you're creating is for the package, for the benefit of the packagers in them understanding where they fit in the reporting groups. But I agree. I think for me to see waxed cardboard in the list just kind of scared me, just to see that thing on the list. So I would like to see, why can't we go green, yellow, red? Everybody in that bucket that is on the materials recyclable list, the approved, the list is green. Everybody that's on the additional list will be yellow, and everybody on that we would rather not see is on the red. And then if we're looking at this, and them too, they can see themselves then in that grouping category and identify that, wow, we're a good person, a good participator in that category, while someone else is not. And I know people hate that, but I think the coloring would be a good idea. Thank you.
Can
Pete, any comment on that?
Yeah, I just want to follow up, because I just want to make sure I understand, Rick. And I just want to make sure I follow. So you're suggesting you would prefer more detailed reporting categories. Is that what you're saying?
No, I like the categories you have. I think it benefits the producers, but from a visual perspective, it'd be nice to understand who's on an acceptable list and who's not, because it looks goofy to see somebody who's on the materials list bundled with somebody who isn't. You know what I mean?
So one of the issues we're going to experience is some of those nuances, right? So you know, the example of nursery packaging is probably a good one. So you might have nursery packaging that's accepted in some jurisdictions but not accepted in other jurisdictions. Does it deserve its own category? You know, do tea bags deserve their own category? Or should they be lumped together? And you're going to get some nuances between jurisdictions about which one is accepting what. You're talking about probably a small part of an overall larger category. But again, it's that question of, does it make sense to how finitely are we separating out this list?
I understand.
Just a quick question, Rick, on that. Would you have a recommendation for that particular, the nursery packaging? Like how you would see that going if it's in one jurisdiction, it's collected, and in another it's not?
Well, I thought the idea here was this had nothing to do with what we were collecting. This had everything to do with the influx of packaging into the state, and you trying to help minimize the reporting impact on the packagers. So I thought what you did there was appropriate. You're trying to give them an easier reporting pathway. And I was just trying to identify how you could, in those buckets, you could identify who's on a materials list that is accepted and who. So I don't know where the because what I thought is, if it's on the materials accepted list, and even if it's a pot, it is accepted throughout the state of Colorado. So there is no movement on what we're collecting, right? Am I missing something?
I think it's a question for Pete, but I think I may be wrong here, but I think that in this category for nursery packaging, that would be an additional material list, correct? Some can collect and some not. So in that way, in what you're proposing, Rick, that would be yellow.
Correct.
Right? So in green would be the MRL. If it's up to the jurisdiction to collect, it would be yellow. And if it's off the list, it's red.
Right.
That's what you're proposing. And so I don't know, Pete, if you have a response to that. So in this case, that the nursery packaging, I'm assuming would be a yellow and it would have that. So I don't know if that, Pete, if that fits with what you're doing or if it completely kind of messes all of that up.
Yeah, I mean, I guess what I'm saying for reporting categories, I think all we're saying is we're not creating a separate category for nursery packaging based on what's proposed, because then you have potentially multiple different resins that packaging could be made out. So you're creating a huge additional amount of material lists. So that's going to get lumped into it's going to get lumped into the categories that deal with whether that's polypropylene or whatever that nursery packaging is made of. It gets lumped into those categories. Again, we're trying to get it into a list that makes more sense, or category that makes more sense. So it doesn't totally map, but again, I think it's just trying to find reason within the categories and trying to make it easy, yet being able to allow us to differentiate between how those materials are managed within facilities.
Thanks very much. I appreciate it. I know I was kind of confused.
No, that's helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, good questions. Well, this created a few other questions or comments. So we've got Gail, someone in the Darla group, Scott DeFife, and then Clinton. Gail?
Yes, thank you, Gail, Gary, City of Steamboat Springs City Council. And I see Scott has asked if we could go back to that slide. I think that might be helpful as we have our conversation, because I also have follow-up questions to Caroline and Rick's questions in terms of, I certainly understand the need for simplification and kind of streamlining the reporting. But my question is, how does that then impact kind of the cost reimbursements and calculating those reimbursements?
So Gail, it wouldn't affect reimbursement in any way. Reimbursement is set up completely separately. The producer dues will reflect the costs of the overall system, which includes the reimbursements that are being provided to collectors and to processors and education and other types of elements. So they're not tied to each other.
Well, okay, help me understand that a little bit more then. So to the extent that you have a MRF that doesn't accept these materials,
Oh, I got you. Yeah.
how does that factor into this?
So these categories then would be, there would be the due would be set, and again based on each of these materials and their I mean, as we explained in the different sessions, they would be assessed based on the cost to manage that material within the system, the associated revenue, how much material is being supplied into the marketplace, and they would be assessed individually. So each reporting category, so those 51 categories, would be assessed different rates for the relevant costs within the system.
Okay, so if like a MRF doesn't accept that, anything that, let's say, that's on the additional recycling list, but they want to upgrade, that they upgrade their infrastructure to do that,
Yes.
that
Yes.
would then be included.
We would look at there's a piece within the legislation that also talks about a special assessment. So if we're looking at our processing side and we're saying, look, we're looking to take some of those additional materials and try to move towards facilities accepting them. We're going to negotiate with those potential MRFs around accepting more materials over a period of time. And they'll say, look, this is what our costs are to take on these new materials. And that associated cost then would apply to that specific material as to the costs of the system.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Gail. In the Darla group.
Thank you, Scott. Darla Aarons, CDPHE. And I just want to echo the sentiments, Pete, to condense this list down to 51 categories. I know that was a huge undertaking. And they also attempt to harmonize with other states. So I also think there's a fine line between oversimplifying, just to kind of echo Scott and Caroline's comments. But my comment is more specifically related to, I think it was back another slide. There was an original covered material category, maybe one more, that had some exempt materials on it, like the paint containers. But it also included pesticides, and then it also included motor oil containers. And it was suggested that we combine those under one reporting category. So I guess my concern there is that we need to keep a tab on what the impacts of those exempted materials are. So I think having that data separated and kept separate in their own categories will be useful for us going forward to analyze the impact of exemptions.
So some of those materials, I guess, may not be exempt, right? So that category with used oil, so used oil, or it's not used oil, oil containers, petroleum containers aren't exempt.
Right, exactly, that's my point.
Yeah.
But they're combined with two other materials that are, it's being proposed they get combined into one.
Yeah, but it's only for those materials that are, so again, some of the category titles are based on the fact that, so paint cans are exempt in Colorado, but they're not exempt in Oregon. So we've created a category to reflect these materials where they are required to report. So there'll be information within the legislation or within the guidance that will say if it's exempt in this jurisdiction. But again, we're trying to create that common category across states.
So there will be an ability for them to report that separately? Is that what I just heard?
If they're exempt, no. We don't want exempt producers to be reporting their data because that then messes with the targets that are being set for the program.
So there's a difference between exempt producers and exempt material, though. So if there's an obligated producer, they still can report their data, they just don't pay dues on the exempt material. So we can take the conversation offline and talk about that more, but I think it's important to capture as much data as we can. And then also on this slide, since you switched over to this slide too, combining PVC with PET, I guess they are both film, but those seem pretty different to me, Scott. I don't know what you think about that. It seems like a big combination of a lot of different types of plastics.
They're all laminates that can't be recycled.
Yeah. Okay. And then my third comment was around the wrapping paper, the non-metallized gift wrap, because I remember there was quite a bit of feedback around wrapping paper, and I just want to make sure our MRF folks and processors are okay with that being moved over to a more generic category, because I think that was broken out for a reason from what I recall.
So maybe just if I can comment just before, so this is the reporting category, so it's not what we're relaying to people. It's in order for us to capture information to establish fees. One of the concerns is if people are reporting on exempt products, I understand CDPHE may want the data on it, but it messes up our ability to charge fees. How do we charge fees if people are reporting in a category for materials that are not included? I think that creates an issue for us in establishing fees and setting targets and running the program.
Let's keep that conversation going outside of the meeting. Pete, I have some ideas around that.
And sorry if I can just jump in, Caroline Mitchell, City of Fort Collins. I just wanted to sort of summarize my suggestion based on the answers to the questions, Peter, and that's that I would recommend, I appreciate the goal to simplify, and also I would recommend we take a lens of exactly how all of these different categories of materials will be used, and if they either span lists or will be used for different purposes, that we keep sort of the material categories clean, if you will, based on what will actually happen with that. All the things in that category are going to be used operationally in the same way, because we can always aggregate data later, but we can't disaggregate. And so just making sure we're thinking, since this will be such an enormous set of information that we haven't gotten before, making sure that we're not setting up some operational challenges because of aggregation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, I totally take that point. I think the only thing I would just caution as well is this will be the first time that producers are reporting in the United States. We know that there is a level of sophistication that comes with reporting this type of data. So the more nuanced you become in your categories, the more potential you also do run with problems with the data that people are reporting in.
Okay, well, it sounds like you're looking to balance that, but it's a good point there, Caroline, about disaggregating. It's more difficult to disaggregate if it's aggregated because you don't know where but you can aggregate the different materials up front. But I think, Pete, sounds like you're trying to balance that, but this is part of the discussion. All right, we have some more comments. Scott DeFife, Clinton, and then Rick.
Thank you, Scott DeFife, Glass Packaging. I think I put my hand up when Rick was talking about the nursery tubes. So I just generally, I mean, I was sympathetic with his point. I think stuff that we had dealt with that wasn't on the green list is coming back in somehow, and I'm not entirely sure I understand exactly what this is for, but I'm going to make two other notes. It just strikes me again, I understand the need for the PRO to try to harmonize as much as it can with the other state lists, but Oregon's in a completely different stratosphere than Colorado on what it's looking for and what it was designed for, to address much more hard to recycle things that weren't being accepted in their base system. And Colorado's just trying to get up to a point where they get, parity with another state's base system. So I'd rather harmonize down and let Oregon deal with new Oregon stuff than have everybody else have to deal with Oregon stuff when they're not in Oregon. And then I just want to put another note. If it's plastic tea bags is the thing, I'm not trying to dig on plastic tea bags, but they're small and they probably don't fit the 2-inch thing. And, not all squeezable tubes fit the 2-inch thing. And where those are all going to end up. And we can go back out to Broomfield and take a look at them and catalog them for you. But, more is not necessarily better in this situation. So anyhow,
Scott,
because ultimately that's where the plastic tea bag is going to end up.
Sorry, and yeah, it's probably right that the tea bags would end up in the small format. Um, uh, so in each of these categories, there will be advice that will be applied as well. So there are tips that we are trying to look to build in to make sure that we say, if you are under this, then you need to report into this. So we are trying to draw some lines because, again, like under the HDPE line, we're probably going to have people that are going to look at that category. And the question will be for an oil container, do I report under this one, or do I need to know I need to report under a separate plastic category? So we have to have some reporting tips throughout to sort of point people back to potentially where they may need to report in as opposed to another category. So there is some nuances on or some clarity that needs to be provided. I know that the team has spent a lot of time looking at the difference between an aerosol container and a pressurized container. And who knew there was such a world out there? So I mean, we're looking at those types of factors to try to provide greater clarity so that they're reporting into the right type of category. So lots of
If this is,
all of these.
this doesn't have to do with the acceptable list as much as this has to do with the producers reporting their product.
Correct. And again, the idea would be we want to make sure that producers can look at, we need them to report in Oregon, and I understand Oregon may not be the jurisdiction you may want to look at, but producers are going to need to report in Oregon and they're going to need to report in Colorado. And ideally, they've got a list of reporting categories that they can take and say, here's what I'm tracking for next year, so that I can report into both of those two states, even though the categories may not be exactly, the reporting categories may be exactly the same. They need a way to be able to sort of map and say, in Oregon, it's this category. Oregon doesn't have a certified compostable category, but in Colorado, it's this certified compostable category. So they need to be able to know how to track that across the states. And I think that's what we're trying to work through to make sure it's as simple as possible for those producers to track and hopefully accurately be able to report their information into us. And that accuracy is important for us of trying to make sure we find that balance of making sure that we're getting good information in that we can actually substantiate. Sorry.
I'll save my extra Oregon comments for offline.
So Pete, you already mentioned you're going to be providing some definitions for the categories as well as examples. And so that was one example that you'll probably be providing some more, which could give some greater clarity to this. All right, Rick, over to you, and then Clinton.
Yeah, Rick Cater, Swordfish Consulting, Murphs. So again, I'm 70 years old almost, and this is confusing sometimes to me. But so you're not suggesting. So when I'm a clear PET thermoform producer, I'm going to report in as PET number 1. But in reporting into you, I'm going to identify myself as clear PET thermoform. So you're tracking that information on the inbound, correct?
No, they're going to report into that category as to the amount of tons of that material that they're reporting in.
So
we're not separately putting out the specifics. They're going to report into each of these categories as to the amount of materials that they're supplying into Colorado. So how much of their material is, fits under that category versus HDPE, other rigids versus. So they're providing us the amounts of materials that they're supplying into Colorado based on those 51 categories.
Okay, so in that bucket in the bottom, you'll never know the difference between how much PVC film you bring in or PET film you bring in or polypro. You're never going to understand that. And
so we may look to take that category and break it out in further years. We may look to break that out. But at this point, we're looking at a single category for that material to be able to report in on that category.
Okay.
And again, keep in mind, you're going to have distributors that are going to need to report in on this stuff that are going to be, who knows how many different types of products that they're managing in, and going to need to report this amount of detail into CA when potentially they're not even collecting that information right now.
Yeah, I don't know. I think it's important information. I agree with Caroline and Darla. I think simplifying is a great, wonderful thing, but just being able to go, I belong to the plastic laminates and other flexible plastic packaging category, and not having any background information on that. I don't understand why they can't identify themselves in that bucket, but tell you what they are, so that you can then on the backside at least track the difference between PET and PVC film, for instance, or these other categories. That's just my comment.
Thanks.
Thank you, Rick. Clinton?
Clinton Sander, A1 Organics. I think this kind of touches in on what Richard is kind of, I think, saying too, is with this simplified, and again, simplifying is helping or is helpful, but does this affect potentially the circularity of moving to materials that are more of a circular system that actually can be recyclable, and trying to encourage, the best materials for recycling? Because now you're not tracking the data within these categories. So you're kind of getting away from looking at, a recyclable material versus a non-recyclable material, but it's put into the same category. Does that make sense? Like, doesn't this kind of affect like it's maybe not the eco-modulation, but the circularity of the system of the overall goal, moving us all towards quality recyclable materials that have end markets that have value? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're trying to balance the needs. I think we're trying to balance the pressures around this being new to many reporters, and ensuring that we're getting solid categories. There's always the question: is more data mean better, better outputs, better information? I'm not sure that's always the case. There is the question I'd always ask myself as to what degree are we measuring coming out of the back of a MRF? What's coming through? So some of these materials are going to get caught in larger bales. We're not necessarily breaking that material out to that specific detail. So I guess it's a question to me as to what's our starting point? Where do we start at? And then, potentially where do we build out? But I would say that I think what I hear from producers in California is they're terrified by the list that's being put in front of them, which is huge in the amount of materials that they're going to have to, categories they're going to have to report out to, and what's their ability to actually track and put in place what's been asked for.
Pete, could you explain a little, and then we'll go to the next question here. But I think what I'm hearing is the question, like, what do you lose? What do you lose and what do you gain by sort of lumping into the categories? I mean, I think this bottom one here that we're all looking at on slide 28 is pretty clear. There's specifics, and then there's lumping it through a category. And so it sounds like what you gain is it's easier for the producers to really provide data, even though it's going to be lumped together, it's going to get in, it'll be there, perhaps in future years, it might be broken down, and they'll break it down further. What I'm hearing some suggest is that you lose some of the ability to understand what is being collected, what can be recycled, and what is not recyclable, and you lose something there as well. And so, in your words, what do you gain and what do you lose by this switch?
So I guess if I look at the flexible category right now, none of that material currently is considered recyclable. So I'm not sure we're losing anything when it comes to understanding the performance. We know all of these films are a challenge to be able to recycle. I think we can look at separating those out if we're looking to create better systems to collect this material and process this material. But right now, all of those materials are currently non-recyclable. So I guess my question is a bit of, to what end are we asking for more and more detail parsed out by, for what rationale? I'm not sure I know of many jurisdictions that are collecting that type of detail anywhere. And there is a burden that will be placed on companies if they were defining this into this type of detail. And how accurately can they do that within the first year of a program when we're going to provide this information to them in a month or two, and they're going to need to start collecting that data as of January 1st, 2025. That's a lot of an ask of what you're asking a new group of obligated producers to do.
Great, fair enough. Let's go to the Darla Group. Sounds like an investment firm.
Thank you, Scott. Darla Aaron, State of Colorado. Pete, I think we're making good progress here. And I think with 51 categories, we still have a little bit of flexibility, maybe to just grow it out a tiny bit more. But my question is around, I guess first I want to confirm my understanding that I heard correctly. Some of these initial covered material categories are being proposed to be combined. So the bottom row on this slide, for example, those are all on the not accepted list, neither of the acceptance lists. But some of the other rows have combined covered material categories that then go into a proposed reporting category that could include something from the minimum recyclable list, something from the additional material list, and something that's not recyclable. So first, is my understanding of that correct? Yes,
Yeah,
okay.
potentially some of the areas, yep.
Okay, so then can you help me understand how, and Clinton touched upon this, but how that then ties into our ability to eco-modulate? So one of the factors, for example, is, the recyclability or the detriment to the system. And if we're combining it into one reporting category, how do we then break that out to be able to eco-modulate it?
So it depends, I guess, on the eco-modulation side around which piece that we're talking about. So there's elements that can be still dealt with because we may be asking for producers to put forward an application for a bonus, and it's dealt with in that type of a way. So there's certainly ways that can still be addressed. If I was to use the example of, again, a pulp, a molded pulp egg carton versus a molded pulp food service packaging, the one is on currently the minimum recyclables list, and one is on the additional materials list. So it's an example of one that is in both lists, but potentially we're dealing with it in one reporting category. The cost to manage that, those two materials in a MRF is going to be relatively similar in how that material flows through that facility. There's obviously potentially more contamination associated with food serviceware. But again, the cost would be relatively similar to manage those materials. So we're trying to create categories that include similar types of materials and similar cost profiles that would be included through those merged facilities. Again, we're looking for feedback on these lists. So if you think that there are things that are, don't make sense, I am sure that there will be lots of feedback we'll receive from our own producer members on this as people look at where potentially their materials might be captured and who it might be captured with. And there'll be pushes and pulls on all of this. And we'll need to take all of that feedback back and try to figure out how to adjust those categories according to feedback we receive.
Great, thank you.
Are there any other comments or questions? Peter, you're at the end of the slides, I believe. Is that correct?
Yes, yeah. So, I think on this one, we'll bring this back to the next meeting. Obviously, we are looking for feedback, I think, on this one as to, and you didn't receive the materials that far ahead of time, so I would appreciate after you've had time to look at the lists and to think through those pieces. And we will try to bring more information back to the group as well. But as I said, we're trying to work this out ourselves to try to create reasonable categories for reporting. And please don't take my comments today back as we're unwilling to consider any changes. We're absolutely willing to consider changes. I just need to play a bit of devil's advocate because we're trying to think this through ourselves as well. So I want to try to figure out what the right balance is as we move forward.
Great. Well, healthy discussion for sure. And I think we opened up this this box a little bit, take a look inside. So it's quite a challenge. Great. So if there's no other questions or comments, then I'm going to hand it over to Brandon for the public comment period. Brandon?
Well, Scott, when do we want to deal with the when do we want to deal with the question of technical and I don't know, Darla, if
we have time to do that now. Yeah, thank you for that. We can handle that now and then go into the public comment period in a minute. So you were talking before about, I don't know how, if you have an ask here, and Darla, if you can chime in here as well, if you might have a solution, a proposal, something concrete that the group can perhaps agree on or discuss would be helpful.
I took Darla Aarons, state of Colorado, and I took a quick glance at the 2024 schedule. And I'd say on initial glance, I'd like an opportunity to talk through that list of topics with you, Pete. So my suggestion would be to keep the October technical work session on the books. Pete and I can get together and see if there were any big misses. I'd also like to ask the board if there are other topics that you either feel it's really important to revisit or topics that we didn't discuss that you would like to have us discuss during one of the technical work sessions, or if you think that we can just handle it during the regular business meetings in November and December. And then we can revisit this at the later October. I think it's October 26th, right?
October 21st is the
Okay.
technical work session from 12:30 to 3:30 if we need all of that time. And then the next scheduled advisory board meeting is on November 13th from 12:30 to 3:30. So those would be the next two meetings scheduled.
Okay. Does that sound good, Pete?
Sure, yeah, yep.
Okay.
Thank you, Darla. Appreciate that.
Yep.
All right. So with that, Brandon, over to you.
Thank you, Scott. We only have one member of the public in the queue right now, but I do want to have a call out that if anyone does want to provide public comment here, just put your name and affiliation in the chat and we will call on you. But now it's going to be over to Brian Loma. Brian, if you can please unmute, say your affiliation and provide your 2-minute comment.
Good afternoon, folks. My name is Brian Loma. I'm proud today to be upgrading my representation from just myself to the Green Latinos here in the state of Colorado. A couple of quick thoughts because I only have 2 minutes. The first thing is that I didn't hear at the beginning of the presentation any stresses or concerns about the free allocation mass balance accounting methodology as being opposed. I am aware that there is some Colorado-based efforts to draft letters to oppose such accounting methodologies. And I really appreciate the deep conversation that's gone on today about the materials, how we're tracking them, and understanding that we are going to limit the quantities of waste that are produced in our state while our populations continue to grow. So eco-modulating out hard to recycle items, understanding what's coming in so that we can look at additional materials to claim and capture. And even if one state is requiring it and maybe we're not requiring the recycling materials, knowing what's there so that we can reevaluate, being highly important factors. I applaud everybody in this very important and difficult task, and continue to just enjoy this process. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Brian. And Brian was our only commenter for today. So thank you for your feedback, Brian. We will compile your comments and we'll include them with the meeting summary. As a reminder to all members of the public, you can always submit written comments as well as questions at any time by email to eprcomments@state.co.us, which I've just put into the chat. And I'll go ahead and I'll turn it back over to you, Scott.
Great. Thanks very much, Brandon. And Brian, thank you very much for your comment. Very important. I also, Pete, I want to thank you for, being the workhorse here today, for the presentations, answering all the questions, a lot of things newly discussed, or at least in this fashion here. So I appreciate that. And all of the board members, of course, thank you very much for, jumping in and wrestling with this as well. So we're at that time of the meeting to recap, talk about next steps, and then to adjourn, which will be a little earlier than normal for these meetings. PSI will draft up, Clinton, yay. PSI will draft up the notes from today's consultation and flag any follow-up items needed. And Brandon has put in to the post here the advisory board link. So meeting materials will be posted on this link, the department's webpage, within the next few days. That's with the slides and so forth. And the next technical work session, I'll repeat here, will be on October 21st from 12:30 to 3:30 Mountain Time. And the next scheduled advisory board meeting is on November 13th from 12:30 to 3:30. So members of the public, stakeholders, advisory board, again, thank you very much for all the comments here. So it's time now to adjourn. So can I get a motion, please? Scott DeFife, I see you unmuted.
Scott DeFife, Glass Packaging, so moved.
And Gail, I see another unmute. Go for it.
Yep. Gail Gary, City of Steamboat Springs City Council. I second the motion.
Okay. All those in favor?
Aye.
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 Any opposed? All right. Approved unanimously. And the 31st Producer Responsibility Advisory Board meeting is now adjourned at 3 p.m. on the dot. All right, everyone. Thanks very much and take care. Bye.
Thanks. Have a good day.